Good evening, and welcome to the first of two videos, maybe three, on Chapter 2 in your textbook, the third portion of Chapter 2, which is all about the brain. Okay, so um, the brain itself is a very complex organ, all right, as you well know. And it's impossible to understand psychology or emotions or behavior or anything else unless you have some understanding of the biological structure and physiological workings of the brain. Now, in this section, we're going to go through the various parts of the brain and talk a little bit about which part each is, or what the responsibility of each part actually is. All right, so buckle up and get ready, and we'll talk about the various portions. Now, the one thing that you should understand is that the human brain evolved from much simpler brains. All right, when you look back down the evolutionary tree to simpler organisms, they don't have the complexity that human beings have. And most mammals and even invertebrates have what we call a brain stem. So this is widely considered to be the oldest portion of the brain. Now, the brain stem itself consists of three major portions. The first is the medulla, and this is the area of the brain that connects the brain to the spinal cord. This is essentially the most important aspect of the brain because it is responsible for regulating all of the involuntary things that your body does, all right, that your brain controls. And this includes things like breathing, heart rate, and digestion. All stuff that you don't think about. There's no conscious effort that goes into digesting your food or beating your heart. You don't think about this at all. It's all automatic. Okay. The second portion is what we call the pons. And the word pons in Latin refers to a bridge, all right? And for any of you who took Latin in high school. But the pons serves as a passageway for neural impulses to and from the cerebellum. We'll get to the cerebellum in a minute, but also to the higher areas of the brain, like the cerebrum. It's also believed to be uh, strongly involved in sleep and in dreams. All right, so the weird dreams that you have, you can blame the pons for them. And then finally, the reticular formation, which is shown, is described here, and also called the midbrain, is a network of neurons that runs up the brain stem into a portion called the thalamus. All right, we'll get to that a little bit later on. This is involved in controlling arousal and awareness. Now, by arousal, I just mean being awake, being fully aware of your surroundings. All right. There are days when you are just kind of, schlumping around and not really thinking. Your kind of brain's in a fog. If that's the case, then your midbrain is kind of shut down a little bit. You might be sleepy, you might be tired, you might be sick. All right. But what I mean by arousal is that you're fully awake and fully aware and ready to go, all the time. And that is the function of the reticular formation or the midbrain. Now, in this slide, it's just a picture of the various portions. The brain stem starts about here and goes up and around. I kind of missed, but this is essentially the brain stem. And there's a couple of parts, all right? We already pointed out the medulla oblongata, all right? That's this area in here, okay? That's what controls the involuntary functions and that sort of thing. The pons is located here, all right? So this is the pons. And then the reticular formation or the midbrain is this portion up here, okay? And of course, if you look down below the brain, this area in here represents the spinal cord, all right? And as you move up the brain stem, you start taking on more and more complex functions. So the medulla oblongata is dealing with the simplest of functions. The pons is dealing with a little bit more complicated functions. And then the midbrain or reticular formation is dealing with even more complex actions on the part of the brain. Now, the second of the four major sections of the brain is the cerebellum. And this is the area that's really responsible for motor control. All right. If you throw a baseball, all right, your aim. If you ride a bicycle, play a piano, and those kinds of things. The cerebellum is the part of the brain that's involved in coordinating all of our movements. All right, such as the sense of balance and motor learning. Alcohol, all right, from beer or wine or a mixed drink, depresses the cerebellum. And this is why people who are intoxicated lose their sense of balance, because it's affecting the cerebellum more strongly than it affects other aspects of the brain. And that's why people who are intoxicated will stumble and fall and that sort of thing. The just above the cerebellum is the thalamus, and this is a relay station for incoming sensory information, except for the sense of olfaction, and this is just a fancy word for smell. All right, but your vision, your hearing, your taste, and a lot of the kinetic senses, the sense of touch, all right, are all controlled or relayed to the appropriate portions of the brain by the thalamus. All right, so it kind of acts like the router on your for your internet. All right, if you've got wireless service inside your home, the thalamus is kind of like the router. And then finally, down here, the basal ganglia. And I'm not going to show you a picture of these because they're buried deep inside the brain, but these are what initiate physical movements. So they're controlled by the cerebellum, and they control the cerebellum. So anytime you move or want to move, the basal ganglia and the cerebellum are communicating to get the appropriate muscles to do their thing. Now, the cerebellum itself is located here. It kind of looks almost like a clover. All right, you see it in the back of the skull here. So it sits behind the brainstem. Actually, at this point, I should point out that over here on the left, this would be the front of the brain. So this is your forehead over here, and this is the back of the brain. Okay, and in this picture, we're looking at the brain from the top. This is the back, and this is the front. All right, just so that you have a little bit of orientation, a perspective as to where you are. But here's the cerebellum, and then the other portion that we talked about was the thalamus, and that's this portion of the brain right here. And you can see that they're close together, and they do communicate quite frequently through the interneurons in there. Okay, so that's the cerebellum and the thalamus. Now, so we've now covered the brainstem and the cerebellum. Next, we're going to talk about the diencephalon. Now, the diencephalon is what controls what we call the limbic system. And this is the system of your body that really is considered to be the reward center. All right, these are the things that make you feel good: eating, drinking, sex, and the endorphins that are released when an athlete, is pushing himself or herself harder. Those are pleasurable aspects to life, and they are controlled by the limbic system. The limbic system is, the limbic system is composed of the hypothalamus, which is involved in regulating those basic drives that we just talked about. But it also is in charge of controlling the pituitary gland. which is part of the endocrine system, and the pituitary is what maintains the body's internal environment. The pituitary is kind of like the master gland in the endocrine system. Okay. We also have here the hippocampus. This is involved in the formation of memories, especially memories that are associated very strongly with emotions like anger or happiness, or even sadness. And then finally, the amygdala down here, this is the portion of the limbic system that actually controls your emotions, anger and sadness and happiness. All right, we talked about the theories of emotion in chapter 1. All right, the amygdala is the portion of the brain that actually controls those emotions. Now, not only does it control our own emotions, but it also has the ability to allow us to interpret other people's emotions. You know, I can look at my little daughter here, and I can tell when she's happy, and I can tell when she's sad. All right, and I just have to look at her face, and I know. And human beings have that ability. We can look at other human beings and know whether they're happy or sad or angry or whatever, just by looking at their faces. And the amygdala is involved in controlling that. Now, the hypothalamus, remember this was the potato-like thing up here was the thalamus. The hypothalamus is this area in here, just below the thalamus. And if you think about it, the word hypo means below. And so it makes sense that the hypothalamus would be below the thalamus in the brain. But even further below the hypothalamus is the pituitary gland. Now, this isn't actually part of the brain. Remember, it's an endocrine gland. And so it's responsible for releasing a number of different hormones that control all of the other endocrine glands, right? And so it is in direct contact with the hypothalamus. And so there's signals constantly going back and forth between the hypothalamus and the pituitary. And so the nervous system and the endocrine system are actually working together. Okay. So that's the diencephalon. Okay, so we've covered 3 portions: the diencephalon, the brainstem, and the cerebellum. The last portion that I want to talk about is the cerebrum. And when you look at the brain from the outside, what you're actually looking at is the cerebrum. So this is the biggest portion of the brain, but it's also the most evolutionarily complex portion. All right, simpler animals like a shark. All right, a shark's brain only really contains this portion. All right, along with a tiny little cerebellum over here. All right, it's a much simpler brain than ours. All of this stuff up here that makes up the cerebrum is important in all of the phenomenally complex things that the human brain can do that simpler animals just don't have the ability to do. So we have to talk about the cerebral cortex first, all right? The cerebral cortex is all of those layers of interconnected cells that cover the brain's 2 hemispheres. So all of that stuff that looked like noodles that you saw in the lower right-hand corner of the previous picture, that's the cerebral cortex. It is the control center of the nervous system. It's the processing system of the nervous system. It's where we perceive things, where we remember things. It's the center of language, decision-making, and all of the high-level cognitive activities that we can actually do. Now, the 2 hemispheres are indeed connected. As a matter of fact, I'm going to show you a video in a little while about what happens if the connection isn't really working well. But the connection is called the corpus callosum. And this is just a bridge of nerve cells that connects the left side of your brain and the right side of your brain. Okay, so you do have 2 sides, and the 2 sides are different from one another. They control different aspects of your cognition. Now, The two hemispheres are each divided into 4 different lobes. Now, this is looking at the right side of the brain. You can see here's the brain stem. Here's the this is the brain stem here. This is the cerebellum here. All right, but all of this is the cerebral cortex. In this case, you cannot see the diencephalon because it's buried deep inside the cerebral cortex. Now, the four lobes are essentially here, and I'm not going to draw much of this, but this is the frontal lobe, Frontal. This up here is what's called the parietal, Parietal. The potato-like one down here, this is called the temporal. And then finally, in the back, we have what's called the occipital lobe. Now remember that there's 2 hemispheres, and each hemisphere has all 4 of these lobes. So you got a left frontal and a right frontal, a left parietal and a right occipital, and a left temporal, and so on. Okay. Now, each of these lobes controls a different aspect of your cognitive abilities. All right. So, and one more thing, just so that you know, this line here. Let me change colors on the pen. We'll do green because there's no real green here. But this line right here is called the central fissure. All right, which essentially means hole in the ground or canyon. Okay, central fissure. And this one right here, and again, sloppy, but separating the frontal and parietal from the temporal, this one is called the lateral fissure. Lateral. I know that's sloppy, I'm sorry. But lateral just means the side. All right, so you have the central fissure and the lateral fissure, and those are the portions of the brain. Now, one more slide, and we'll quit for this video. But this slide just basically describes what each of the 4 lobes does. The frontal lobe is the area in front of the central fissure and above the lateral fissure. All right, so if you go back, all right, that's this area in here, right? Here's the central fissure, here's the lateral fissure, so it's in front of the central and above the lateral. It contains what we call the motor cortex. And this is what sends out information to all of your muscles and glands and everything else. Back to this picture, see the blue stripe here? This is the motor cortex. Come on now. All right, so this is the motor cortex. Okay, and that's responsible for sending information out. The parietal lobe is the area behind the central fissure and above the lateral fissure. And so again, that's this area in here. Okay. Now, it contains, don't know what just happened. It contains the somatosensory cortex. And that is responsible for taking in information from all of your senses, your eyes, your ears, your tongue, your especially your sense of touch, especially your sense of touch. All right, that's the most important one. And that is represented by the orange line that you see. I don't have orange on here. We'll use yellow. All right, but that's this line in here. All right. And so this is the somatis. Yellow is a really bad choice. Let me do this again. Magenta. I don't know what magenta is, but oh, it's purple, purplish pink. Somatosensory cortex. All right, and that's the orange line here. All right. Notice that the somatosensory cortex and the motor cortex are literally right next to each other. Even though they're on two different lobes in the brain, they are talking to each other all the time. So if you sense something with your fingers, all right, the response or the sense goes into the somatosensory cortex, and then the response to that comes out of the motor cortex. So if you put your hand down on a hot stove and you pull it away real quick, right, that's what's going on. The sense goes up through your nervous system to the somatosensory cortex. It jumps over, it's processed and jumps over to the motor cortex, which tells you, hey, dummy, get your hand off the stove. Okay. Okay. The temporal lobe is the area beneath the lateral fissure. So it's this area in here, and it contains what we call the primary auditory cortex. So auditory refers to your ears, hearing, right? And if think about that, it kind of makes sense because what's right outside your skull, outside of the temporal lobe, your ears, okay? Finally, you have the occipital lobe all the way in the back, and it contains the primary visual cortex, all right? And that is where your vision is actually processed. Now remember, this is the front up here. This is the back out here. So literally, your vision is processed in the back of your skull. Have you ever heard that phrase? You got eyes in the back of your head? Well, it turns out that you actually do. All right, that's where your vision is actually processed, in the back of your head. Okay, so that is the end of the first of two, I think, videos on the brain, and I hope you learned something.